Remedies for breach of contract. There are three types of breach by the buyer. Firstly, failure by the buyer to take delivery. Secondly, failure by the buyer to accept goods. And thirdly, failure by the buyer to pay for the goods. Section 55 of the Sale of Goods Act 1957 provides that the seller may sue the buyer for the price, and Section 56 of the same Act further provides that seller is entitled for damages from the buyer. Rights of unpaid seller against the goods. A seller is deemed to be an unpaid seller in two situations. Firstly, when the price has not been paid, and secondly, when the negotiable instrument is bad in law. Besides Sections 55 and 56 of the Sale of Goods Act, there are other remedies for unpaid seller. These are all covered under Section 46 of the same Act. Firstly, right of lien. Secondly, right of stoppage in transit. And finally, right to resell. Right of lien. This right is dependent on possession. Section 46 of the Sale of Goods Act 1957 provides that an unpaid seller has the right to retain possession until payment is made by the buyer. This right exists even where the property, that is a title, in the goods has passed to the buyer. The right of lien can be used in circumstances where the goods have been sold without any stipulation as to credit. Secondly, the rights can also be used where the goods have been sold on credit, but the term of credit has expired. And lastly, the buyer becomes insolvent. However, the unpaid seller loses his lien when he, that is the seller, delivers the goods to a carrier for the purpose of transmission to the buyer, or where the buyer or his agent lawfully obtains possession of the goods, or even when he waives his right as agreed to a subsale by the buyer. Right of stoppage in transit. Section 50 of the Sale of Goods Act 1957 provides that an unpaid seller who has parted with the possession of the goods has the right of stopping them in transit when the buyer becomes insolvent. Insolvent here means when a person has ceased to pay his debts in ordinary course of business or cannot pay his debt as they become due. This right of stoppage in transit applies only when the buyer is insolvent while the goods are in the control of the carrier. This right ends when the buyer or his agent takes delivery of the goods from the carrier or arrival of the goods at the appointed destination. Right to resell. Power of resale means an unpaid seller can give a good title to a second buyer, but liable to the original buyer for breach of contract. Right of resale means the seller can give title to the second buyer and not liable to the original buyer. When does the seller has the power to sell? Meaning, when does the seller can give a good title to second buyer but liable to the original buyer? This is when the property in the goods, which is the title, has not passed to the original buyer and the seller has no problem to transfer the title of the goods because he is still the owner of the goods. Or when the seller resells after he has exercised his right of lien or stoppage in transit. Thus, the second buyer can have a good title. When does the seller has the right to resell? Meaning, when can the seller give good title to the second buyer and not liable to the original buyer? This is when the goods are of perishable nature. And secondly, when the seller who has exercised his right of lien or stoppage in transit give notice to the buyer of his intention to resell and the buyer fails to pay or tender the price, or when the seller in the original contract expressly reserve a right of resale in case the buyer make default. There are few remedies available to the buyer. Firstly, damages for non-delivery of goods. Section 57 of the Sale of Goods Act 1957 states, if the seller wrongfully neglects or refuses to deliver goods to the buyer may sue the seller for damages for non-delivery. Second remedy available to the buyer is specific performance. Section 58 of the Sale of Goods Act 1957 provides that it is the discretion of the court to grant specific performance on the application by the buyer for breach of contract to deliver specific goods. The third remedy available to the buyer is for the buyer to take an action in tort. The buyer can go to the court and apply for a tort of conversion, which is wrongful interference with the goods. This is where the property and the goods has passed to the buyer and where his entitlement to the delivery is being withheld. The last remedy available to the buyer is for the buyer to sue the seller for breach of warranty. The buyer can sue the seller for damages for breach of warranty.